This was an impressive speech, and it's quite difficult to come back to quite ordinary topics like the ones that will be pondered by the next panel. Violence, war are, of course, topics which make us feel modest when dealing with international agreements like the EU. Nevertheless, the next panel will focus on the tension between the nation states on the one hand and European contracts and agreements on the other hand. And yet, it's possible to draw a line between the talk and the panel because the European project started off with what we have heard about a minute ago: disastrous wars and warlike conflicts, millions of dead people. The European project is first of all a project meant to create peace. That's at least how broad elites see it. And the project was an attempt to establish links of authority and action between the European nations. The idea was to create a trap, not like shark meant it, but a trap, a good trap, meant for those who were still seeking for confrontation in Europe, or who were seeking for confrontation in Europe again through trade, through specialization. An attempt was to be made in order to keep individual nations from waging wars. The European Association of Coal and Steel was the first step, followed by the intensification of trade and the 4 fundamental freedoms in the European Union. The project has been a politically successful one, and the peace dividend was complemented by a major wealth dividend, at least for many of us. So it was a good project, a beneficial one for many of us because of the wealth and well-being created, because maybe the EU was meant to keep peace, but this is not the main goal the peoples in Europe see. The peoples rather focus on economic wealth and on money, and this is being created by the European institutions. So it's very important that the peace project creates economic well-being, because otherwise it will only be an elites project and the peoples will opt out. Until 1995, it was a true success story, and a lot of prosperity was created within the EU. Since 1995, however, the project has started to stumble, and a number of decisions were taken many of us consider not very good, including the establishment of the European Monetary Union, but also a number of other minor decisions which have meant that we are starting to criticize lots of things, product standardization, for example. I mean, we've just heard about wars, so the question is, why do we get angry about product standards? Since there is peace in the world, we should not. And yet, the topic seems to be an important one. And the European Union, if we look back at the last 2 decades, in addition to the peace dividend, has not reached much more. The peace dividend, in addition to the economic dividend. The European project was meant to bring wealth. It was a promise. I remind you of the Lisbon Declaration adopted in the year 2000 when the Commission met in Lisbon. It promised that in the next few years, and here I quote,
The Union has today set itself a new strategic goal for the next decade to become the most competitive and dynamic knowledge-based economy in the world, capable of sustainable economic growth with more and better jobs and greater social cohesion.
Now that was in the year 2000. Now, looking back at the year 2010, we realized that this promise was never fulfilled. These topics will be discussed by the next panel. I'm happy to introduce the panelists to you now. Albrecht Ritschl, Professor of Economic History at the London School of Economics. Christoph Paulus of the Humboldt University in Berlin, an expert in the field of international debt crises. And Wolfgang Schön, representing the tax law side of the Max-Planck-Institut für Steuerrecht und öffentliches Recht in Munich. And now I'm going to become your host, and I would like to ask the first question. How popular is the view that Europe is a peace project in the UK? Do people see it? Do they think it's important? Well, the historically correct answer is that Winston Churchill was very much in favor of the European project as a peace project, but the UK, of course, was outside of it according to his perspective, apart from the military dimension. So he was a prophet in this respect. I'd like to come back to a question someone asked me during the break, and it's an important one, because during our conversations in the last hours and days, one aspect popped up time and again, i.e., we have gotten used to never acting directly, i.e. decisions which had to be taken were delegated, were shifted to Europe so that Europe could be bashed. And that's an evil trick, I'd say. Europe is, so to speak, the scapegoat in the setting, and you hit the scapegoat, and this discredits what you have just said. So it's not the golden calf we pray to because it brought peace and wealth, but it's the scapegoat we hit. Have I taken your question away from you? Please bear with me. It was an important remark I wanted to make, and I wanted to see it in this very context, because Europe has been represented in a much worse way than it is. Now, will the UK opting out change Europe's role in the global society? Well, it depends on whether further fragmentation and destabilization will follow from the Brexit. There are two conclusions I see. One, the recognition that Europe is a peace project which includes values that go far beyond the benefits of trading as compared to an isolated nation or an isolated UK. And the peace order is certainly also one of the aspects people do not always see in a situation of wealth and well-being, but they do see it when there is a crisis. Just imagine further aggressions by Russia against the Balticum nations, for example, the Baltic nations. But there is a second aspect we need to see. Europe is not alone. Europe is not facing the question whether it should fall apart and furthermore consist of individual nations or whether it's an integrated being. Europe needs to act in a context, as Mr. Maurer has just described, and is part of a global setting. And one of the benefits of Europe in the last decades has been a quantitative one. 1 billion in China, 1 billion in India, 300 million in the US, 300 million in Russia. And we could also mention Brazil and Africa. And a central statement has always been 450 million Europeans can do much more than 60 million here, 80 million there, 30 million over here. And that's another benefit we should protect and safeguard, because individual countries cannot achieve more in individual negotiations because they are also competing. At least it's difficult for them to achieve more alone. And the third aspect is also one about those who are in favor of a renationalization, be it in England, be it in the US. It's those who believe that they are losers because of a globalization process, and their manifestation or expression is not only based on a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding why we are in difficult social conditions and why there is unemployment. This is probably not due to Europe, but also because we are facing the outcome of a decade-long process which has shifted prosperity from Europe and the United States to what we used to call the third world. Jobs, hundreds of millions of jobs were shifted outside. They created well-being from Vietnam to South Africa. So we really have to ask ourselves what renationalization could mean. As Mr. Berger said, this does not mean that a single job will be returned to Europe, but it's an ideological hope for turning back the time. And this is not only about gaining sovereignty, but it's about a time machine in order to go back to the 1950s or the 19th century and the political powers of the time. And there's going to be a lot of disappointment in the end because it won't work, and we will have to beware of this disappointment. So I think we need to maintain Europe as a peace project, a social project, and maybe we need a bit of education and enlightenment concerning the reasons why people are dissatisfied, not only in England, but elsewhere too.
I believe you can rail at the Brexit for several reasons. I'm affected as well. I've got a little house in London, children in London, my work. I cannot simply get away. But I think it is not absolutely correct if this decision is considered to be a consistent decision in favor of deglobalization, renationalization. To the extent the Brexit is an elite project, is a free trade project. There's the idea we could become members of a North Atlantic Free Trade Union. This is much more interesting than, a potentially protectionist European Union. Well, protectionist, when we talk about the labor market, we want to be protectionist. It happened to me once. I went to a pub, met people I didn't really know, and then an old lady of my age attacked me. And she said, "What are you doing in my country?" And of course, I didn't notice that she had 2 glasses of wine too many. And then she started to hit my shoulder, and she really was acrimonious. She was upset. Why am I here? Why am I taking away jobs of their country fellowmen? And I defended myself. I said I was cold, I didn't swim here, or I didn't walk through the tunnel. No, I was the victim of a headhunter, and she found it even worse. Then things were even worse for her. But apart from that, we have to talk about the globalization losers later. A project of the political elite, I think it is a financial project. And now the question whether this will create wealth in the UK or whether this is a good idea, well, that's a different kettle of fish. But these are certainly not anti-globalization people. I'm not sure whether I can agree to what you said. Distinguishing between right and left has become obsolete, hasn't it? The dividing line today, I believe, is between the globalization winners and the globalization losers. And I want to represent the opinions of people in the audience. I don't know who said it, but it is all about education. Education and training is absolutely necessary in order to overcome this dividing line. This must be given top priority, And like you mentioned, that globalization has more far-reaching effects than the effects which arrive or which are considered to be negative by the losers of globalization. And this is where the dividing line is, isn't it? This is David Marsh's article, "The Brexit is a Clarion Call." Listen to it. And this reminded me of another article I read, and the tenor was the same. Different people were asked to define this clarion call, what they think it is and what they are supposed to be woken up for. There was Mr. Schulz, Mr. Juncker's opinions were given, and also opinions of AfD representatives. So the entire spectrum showing which direction we are walking to. So there was clearly dissatisfaction everywhere, dissatisfaction with whatever. Therefore, I would like to ask the panelists. Now, a clarion, what for? What was the Brexit for? And this in the context of the future of the European Union. I think it is a clarion call referring to what Mr. Scruton said in his presentation when he was talking about the we. Now, where are communities based on solidarity? Who is ready to share welfare profits and stand up for each other? And this is particularly necessary in times of globalization. I think it is required under this pressure. I spent some time after the Brexit at the University of Oxford, and I noticed disappointment among my colleagues. But only after a few days I understood that all this happens on two levels. One, it was the elite project, internal market and internationalization. And of course, here you can argue about pros and cons, that is, whether you will fare better with or without a financial centre, London. But there was also disappointment about the xenophobia, about the removal of solidarity and things like you mentioned when describing this old lady. If a Portuguese professor, and Clement First knows her, she's from Durham, and she does not know anymore whether she should permit her children to speak Portuguese on the bus. Maybe they should speak English. Then I believe it is about more. And the question about the readiness to create a European community of solidarity, Peter and others said, well, this will not work. But, we might have decentralizing trends and tendencies, and they might end up being conflicts, being the cause of conflicts. And I read Road to Serfdom by Mr. Hayek, and I believe he wrote it in 1941. He talked about the project of a future European Union, and his guiding principle was, this European Union will work only if, say, there's an accident in a mine in Wales. The Sicilian fisherman then says, our people have been buried under the rubble. This is what must happen. And I have the impression that we are giving up this idea very quickly. It is a political task which goes beyond the economical advantages. Maybe we should really find back to creating this community of solidarity. Now, this was a question put to everyone. Before I pass on this question, I want to give you David Marsh's answer. The answer to open issues is in the principle of subsidiarity. He is not a German. Self-determination, responsibility, and developing one's own personality as much as is possible, and reduce it and shift it back to the nation states. As much self-determination as possible, but self-realization and things like this as much as is necessary. What do you think? Well, I don't know. This is one of many possible answers. And the result of the referendum doesn't give an answer to this question. It just shows that there is a conflict, a multidimensional conflict between national, international, conflict between generations, conflict between local globalization or integration winners or losers. So if you go to the north of England, then I can say that the situation is not always nice over there, and there were many people voting for a Brexit. And of course there's also a conflict, I would like to point out, below the national level. Professor Scruton mentioned this. You know, there was a very good question from the audience in this respect. I think there is a problem which has not yet been solved. And of course, I do not dare to predict the future. I'm an economical historian. I know a lot about the past. And, you know, about the future, I have to learn and have to practice more in order to become better in this respect. But what we see here, and I learned this from the lady in the pub, one of the reasons for bringing this, I asked her about her identity. And she said, I'm English. I'm not British. I'm English. And I didn't really know what she meant because, you know, we hadn't learned something like this. We learned, like everywhere in Europe, there is an unrestrained admiration for England and its democracy. This is what we learned. And, you know, that within this, no, England, I should say, United Kingdom, but you know that this is not a national state like France or like Germany. No, they consider themselves to be a multinational state. So there might be conflicts breaking up and people do not know how to solve them. And Mr. Sturgeon said, these are not the conditions under which according to which we voted for a Brexit. So who knows? All this is breaking up at present. I don't know what's going on, really. And I would like to ask Christoph Paulus to give an answer. And this in combination with the question, how important is it to harvest the economical, say, pension? How important is it that many people have the idea that the further development of a European Union is tied to an economical dividend, if I may put it this way? Permit me to make a detour, you know, talking about legal aspects or maybe comparing legal systems. So, comparison of legal systems. For almost centuries, we compared legal systems and we said the English have got a common law and therefore have got a completely different legal system in comparison to our system on the continental Europe. And we talked about the differences, and there was one scientist, Mr. Zimmermann, he said the differences aren't that big. You know, we all come from the same root, the Roman law, that is, and he showed commonalities. And suddenly these commonalities appear, surely dressed up slightly differently, but there are commonalities nevertheless. I draw the conclusions from this that language or, you know, talking about certain things also makes a big difference. Let's talk about the differences, or shall we talk about the commonalities? In Europe, we really got used to talking about differences. And the consequence is that we start re-nationalize back to our boxed-in ways of thinking or mindset. Or shall we, and this is my answer actually, and therefore my objection before, maybe we should have the United States of Europe. You know, what Mr. Schulz said, in factual terms, this is certainly not bad. Surely we have to communicate it in a different manner. We have to talk about commonalities. We have to talk about common roots. And one of our panelists here said, what could we achieve by introducing a subject everywhere in Europe, 1 hour every week, talking about Europe or teaching about Europe? And then I asked, what is this Europe about? And then we started talking about the differences, because we do not know where the commonalities are. We've got common roots, yes. And we have prepared something like this in Europe. And this is highly delicate and highly dangerous, and I would like to ask you to refrain from throwing tomatoes. We've had a common church, and over centuries it was important for us. Again, common roots. This is something which we could convey, which we could impart, communicate. Now, before we open the panel discussion, 2 more comments. One comment, Kai, yes, the Europe project has to be tied with benefits in terms of wealth, and this is what Mrs. Clinton and Mr. Trump did in the United States. They promised jobs and work for everyone, but we also have to combine it with an open discussion about the fact that everywhere in Europe it has become very difficult for, say, menial labor, because these jobs are being shifted to low-wage countries, and also the development of technology like robotics. For them, it will be very difficult, extremely difficult, to find and guarantee to them safe jobs with a decent wage. So I think this is important to talk about, not sending, 50 million or something to Europe. There's one request for the floor. Mr. Müller, please. Thank you very much. Renationalization means that Europe is a combination of nation states which agreed on respecting each other nationalities and have peace. There's peace outside Europe, and we also have peace with countries who are not members of the Union. How can we keep this peace? National interests may be less significant, but at the time, after the Second World War, it was all about keeping Germany small. Now, our German romantic way of looking at things sometimes, cause the skepticism of our neighboring countries. What do you mean? What do you want? And this is something which we should bear in mind. A brief answer, talking to my 25-year-old daughter, then I can say she will not understand your question. She is a member of the Erasmus generation. She lived in 5 different countries. And the question about a nation state, well, she believes that this is as important as, asking about where you come from, Bavaria or Baden-Württemberg. And I heard another contribution before. And here the speaker said that there is a subsequent generation, and we will have a big conflict with this generation defining authority. For people who are 30 or 40 years younger, there will be other values, and I cannot give an answer, And you also made some implicit assumptions about the nation state as the basis of everything. I do not know whether the 30 or 40-year-olds still consider this as a basis. I know your assumptions because I've been educated along these lines, but there is a new generation with a completely different mindset, and they see things completely different. Yes, a short anecdote. I've got a colleague. He analyzed why the economic or European or entire politics in Europe, including the German politics, is controlled or has been controlled by the economic interests also in Germany. And he was very serious about this. I believe it shows how important your question is. In other countries, nobody really understands what the German politics or what the driving force of the German politics is. So, politics of interests. This is subsumed, this is assumed, so I think we have to answer it in this respect. But nevertheless, I'd like to collect questions, 2 or 3 questions. You raise your hand, and I think there's another question over here. And yes, at the back. Metternich is my name. You see, we live. You described how your children live, and we, as Germans, have just got a fraction of a vote in the European Parliament. If you compare it with Strasbourg, we always gave in because it was very legitimate in the first years. We always made compromises because we always have seen these peace aspects. But maybe we should show them that we can do things in a different manner. Mrs. Merkel, and, she also speaks Mr. Putin's language, and she talks to Mr. Erdogan. And, it was said that we do not want to have any compulsory military service anymore. But maybe we should start thinking about the fact, what happens when the Germans will not go along, will not play along. Mr. Erdogan suddenly is very quiet, is no longer attacking us, or will notice what the benefits of the EU are for him. Maybe this is important to ask this question. What will happen if the Germans get crazy again? Yeah, third row here. Tassilo Bayern. Mr. Paulus touched on the question which I would like to ask now. I want to do it again. We talk about the collapse of the political institutions, in particular the EU institutions. And my question now is, and we talked about several conflicts, and I wanted to get back to this conflict. And I would like to put this question to everyone of the panelists. The public presentation of national governments to what this vis-a-vis their national electorate, to what extent does it contribute to the collapse of European institutions? I would like to add a third question, or include a third question, and then I would like to ask the panelists to answer these questions. I just wanted to make a comment and come back to what Mr. Schön and Mr. Paulus said. I think one problem with authority is that the elite, and I believe that we in this room are all among this elite, we benefited from globalization, all of us. But the general public has not seen the benefits and the advantages. Now, wouldn't it be in our interest to present the advantages and benefits to those who haven't seen them, and maybe invest our wealth in making sure that this system doesn't collapse? We talked about the costs of a collapse of these systems, and these costs are certainly much higher than, making a smaller contribution to strengthen the social cohesion. And now from right to left. Yes, two short answers, Mr. Bayer. The presentation of the national governments is problematic when it comes to the European institutions. The European Commission is not as legally defined as it is presented. Surely there are many administrative details they are issuing, but the most important decisions are being taken by a cartel of the smaller cartel of the nation countries. And if it comes to the refugee crisis, then of course Mrs. Merkel is going to Turkey all on her own. So the Commission and everything that is being criticized about the European Union is, national politics, but Eurobashing is certainly not the right answer. Then renationalization was mentioned. People and countries could live with each other peacefully. By coincidence, I had a chance to look at the papers and documents of the American founding fathers. And, Virginia and Pennsylvania, the representatives said, well, it's very nice to have these small states, and we are peaceful, and we understand each other, and nothing will change, and then we are going to have trade, and everyone will be well off. But Hamilton and Madison said, well, if you study 2,000 years of history, then you will know there will be divergent interest, economical, political interest, and then there will be minds who will harness this, will use this, and then there will be polarizing or divisive attitudes. So it is certainly not a good idea just to step back or return to what collapse of authority. Following up on what I said. I agree completely with Mr. Schön. Unfortunately, this is something which has developed over time, i.e., you use the European institutions in order to tell the electorate, it's not me, but it's the Europeans who did this. So they are kind of lightning rod for one's own benefit. And I believe this is a most unfortunate development and has to be stopped immediately if possible. And as I said, we should turn around things by 180 degrees. You talked about this redistribution. I cannot say more than what I just said. The winners of globalizations have to involve the losers of globalization more so. And the least step is to explain, to elucidate. This is very important, and it is a problem of education, or maybe phenomenon, which has to be tackled first. And surely you should not stop there. Further steps are necessary, absolutely. But this is my first answer to what you said. Very briefly, playing over rails and the removal of legitimacy of Europe. I think you cannot remedy this simply by introducing the principle of subsidiarity, because this process is an unending one, and then we, break up Europe. We might change this game by giving the European institutions, to a certain extent, a democratic legitimacy. We believe the Parliament in Strasbourg is a talking shop because it doesn't take any decisions. We believe Europe is undemocratic because we cannot remove Mr. Juncker from office. See, these are all shortcomings. Let me also talk about the military aspect, because I believe it is very important. The British Parliament just adopted the renewal of the nuclear submarine fleet. I can say the military dimension of the European project, I believe, is much higher on the agenda, is much better perceived than in Germany. And you need not tell anyone what the Germans are able to do. You see, in the 80s, the people said that the Bundesbank is just the successor to the monetary version of Bantus, and the foreign trade surplus are just a continuation of the old imperialistic policy using economic means. This is what people said. Even intelligent people say this every day. Maybe not necessarily in German-speaking countries, but outside Germany, they do so. Thank you. I would like to thank all panelists. I'd like to thank those listening, those contributing, those asking questions, and I'd like to thank our host for this opportunity. Thank you.